listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
All right, welcome along to my show Straight to Video. How's your week been? Now, I finally fell victim to the dreaded COVID, which when you listen to today's chat, you can really hear it in my voice. Even though when this was recorded, I had no idea that I had it at the time. So, apologies for the grogginess of the voice, or maybe not. You might like it. Answers on a postcard. But today's chat more than makes up for the dodginess of my voice, as today I check in with Jason Sanderson. Now, Jason has worn many hats over his career, starting out as a drummer before heading into music production, working with the likes of Sorry and the Sinatras and some good friends of mine, JD and the FDCs, which is how Jason and I originally met probably about 10 years ago. And more recently, he's become something of a force in the podcasting world. Using the talents he learned from sound recording with musicians, he's been able to adapt that and use these skills to produce some of the most popular podcast shows in the world. Most notably, the one that gave him his first chance, the Jordan Harbinger Show, which regularly commands 15 million downloads a month. Jason is the rock of that show, producing and editing to make sure it sounds the best it can with his company Podcast Tech. And for me, being a podcaster myself, his story and journey is super inspirational, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it too. It's certainly not been a smooth sailing ride for Jason, and to hear how he's navigated it all really makes for a very special story. Before we get to our talk, as always, show some love and support for the UK's finest suppliers of ground and full bean rock and roll coffee, the mighty Dead Skull Coffee, who are offering you, the listener, 15% off any order through their website. Simply head on over to deadskullcoffee.co.uk and add the discount code STV on checkout, and that money off will be all yours. Alright, you can find Jason and his company Podcast Tech over at podcasttech.com. And if you're a podcaster yourself, then be sure to subscribe to Jason's brilliant YouTube channel for Podcast Tech, where he offers some really great tips and advice to help improve and make your podcast journey all the more rewarding. The guy is a star, and I'm sure you'll love hearing all about what brought him to where he is today. So let's dive into my straight to video chat with Jason Sanderson.
Hello.
How we doing, mate?
A long time, hasn't it?
I don't even want to count the years. How's things? You all right?
Yeah, all good. So happy to connect.
Yeah, definitely, mate. Well, I've been watching and stealing ideas for a while now.
Dude, I've been listening to your podcast for a while now, it's so cool, man. Thank you. It's such an honor for you to ask me to come on.
No, I'm looking forward to diving in. So how was the weekend coming back to the UK? All right.
Yeah, just came back for a mate's wedding. It was all good. Fun seeing everybody. It gets a bit lonely out here, just living in the Czech Republic. Feel a little bit isolated language-wise. Everybody speaks English, but, I think that's more of a state of mind thing. It's nice to come back to the UK, and I always get that itch to come back whenever I'm back. I'm like, oh, it'd be nice to come back.
If you did that, though, you'd come back, and after about 6 months, you're like, what have I done?
Yeah. Let's go traveling again.
So when I set out to do this podcast, I wanted to discuss the early signs in people's lives that set them on the path they're on today. But I think what's interesting with your journey is that you've been able to pivot several times in what you do through both good and bad, and along the way take experiences from previous roles and add that to the next. From musician to music producer through to podcast audio engineer. I'd love to trace that time as best we can, but you've let me down though, because I think one of the main throwbacks which I always take from your videos, which I watch, is you nearly always have like a battered, what looks like a SM58 mic straight from the dodgiest venue in the world, front and center, but you've not got it.
I've got it right here. That's the thing, is people think that you have to buy something expensive to make a podcast, and you know very well yourself you can do this thing and get away with it for many years on a very tiny budget. But it's recommended to get good stuff. But, I'm not usually a speaker. I'm more on the production side of things, so it doesn't really matter if I have a good mic or not. really. But for cases like this, I've got a nice microphone today.
Can't go wrong with the SM58. It's like, it's going to do the job. It's going to do the job for me.
You'd be surprised the amount of times that on some of the shows I've been working on where we've interviewed some really high-end musicians or rappers or singers, and you always expect them to at least have some decent audio equipment or at least have an SM58. But it's usually those people that are the worst for it. So they'll just have the Apple earbuds with a built-in mic on it, and that's what they use. It's like, surely you've got an SM58 knocking around the house somewhere, and it's like, it's always those people that are the most unprepared.
Mate, I love that you've just said that. I feel I can vent to you now because you've said exactly what I was going to put forward. I think through all the interviews I've done, it through like 3 or 4 producers in a big posh studio, when it's come to do the interview, they've just used a simple desktop PC. No headphones, nothing. I'm like, this sounds like dog shit.
I think this is important. It's like people seem to not distinguish the difference between jumping on Zoom and having a Zoom meeting because it's become so normal to do that. A few years ago, that wasn't the normal thing to have some kind of meeting online, or they'd be used to Skype, a similar principle. People doing podcasts often can't distinguish the difference between those two things. So you get people without headphones and you've got the bleed between the speakers and the microphones all happening, or they're in a loud, reverby living room, or just something that just sounds absolutely terrible. But it's totally fine to do that on their work meeting call. But for broadcast recording, it sounds absolutely shockingly terrible. And that's why I get hired a lot to do this kind of thing and fix those kind of things.
It does baffle me sometimes that the ones with the worst quality are usually the ones set in a studio. But who knows? Who knows? But I am glad you mentioned it as well. So, you're living out in Prague right now, but you're originally a Yorkshire lad. Is it Barnsley you're from originally?
Not too far from Barnsley, somewhere between Barnsley, Rotherham and Doncaster in the middle.
Where did you see yourself going as a kid growing up? I mean, it's obviously very working class there, mining town, grassroots, hard work. Could you ever see yourself breaking out when you were growing up? Was that the norm?
I think it was a less conscious thing of where I was from. But I found music like yourself at a really early age and it just consumed me. So like from being 12, all I could think about was being a drummer in a band. That's all I wanted to be, was just get a record deal, tour, gig, become a rock star, like become Guns N' Roses if I could, like if that's what I could do, then that'd be brilliant. I wasn't really thinking, I'm in a ex-mining town in South Yorkshire, poorest place in the world, It was just, I just wanted to play and I was consumed by it, and it took my every hour of my life thinking about that. I failed out of my GCSEs at school because all I wanted to do was just music. The only good grade I got was music. That was my everything. So yeah, that's where I was at.
What was the trigger for that? Was there a particular band?
So I feel like it was a few at the same time. Really funny story. My dad was always into rock and heavy metal. So like I grew up with having the AC/DC records around, and there's a few others like Black Sabbath. But where I got really interested in music was firstly with Queen. I was just massively obsessed with Queen, and I'd have a pretend microphone stand on a stick pretending to be Freddie Mercury. And then I slowly realized how cool Roger Taylor was, and I'd be like air drumming to Roger Taylor or whatever. But when the Freddie Mercury tribute concert happened, the Guns N' Roses set just blew me away. I was instantly addicted to Guns N' Roses. Like everything for the next 5 or so years was Guns N' Roses because of that Freddie Mercury set, and Metallica a bit, but like it was, for me, it was Guns N' Roses. And then also my dad really liked Def Leppard. We got Hysteria on cassette. I vividly remember I used to ride motorbikes when I was a kid, and we had this accident in my dad's workshop where we knocked some Land Rover spring over and it landed on my foot and broke my foot. And I remember driving to the hospital and Hysteria playing, and I'll always remember Hysteria now, like as that hospital journey, like going to the hospital with a broken foot. It's just ingrained in me. Like sometimes these accidents happen and it's just embeds a memory in you forever, like that's Def Leppard, Hysteria for me. So I think those 3 bands really, Queen, Guns N' Roses and Def Leppard, really just grabbed me. And then of course after that there was the grunge movement and Nirvana and everything else, and things got heavier after that point, I guess.
So you say you became a drummer at 12. Did a lot of your friends get into music at the same time?
It was just one of my friends, I'll give him a shout, Andy Ray, playing guitar at school, and it was just me and him. And at that time, everybody was frowned upon if you had long hair at school, like in those kind of areas, everybody's into the rave music, and it was like, there was just basically me and him. maybe a few others, but that was it.
Do you have like the denim jacket with the patches on?
I didn't have denim jackets with patches. He did, but I had definitely had the jeans with awls in them, and one of the first people to have Converse shoes and whatnot.
So when did you start actually playing in bands?
Pretty much straight away we was playing together, but this is what led me to my next bit of a swap up as far as getting interested in studio work. Was like we'd be always rehearsing at this rehearsal space not so far from us, and it was part of a studio as well. So we just got obsessed with going down there every week. It was like a ritual. We'd have to go down there twice a week, and eventually I just really enjoyed at the end of the rehearsal going next door and sitting at the back of the room while the other engineers were producing their whatever it was at the time, techno music or whatever. I just enjoyed watching what they was doing with the technology in the back of this room. So I was consumed in both worlds then. It was not just drums, it was like, oh, there's this other thing as well that I can do with all those shiny buttons,
I think you said that through that you found music all over again. That must have felt pretty awesome.
Yeah, like I was on about earlier, how you just consumed by it every single minute of your life, you're thinking about it. It just added another one of those dopamine rushes every time I was around that kind of thing. I want to learn about this now as well. And then also I, at the same time as I was doing that, I was playing in another band and we ended up getting a record deal, did a lot of touring around Europe. Just a really creative time in my life, like from leaving school basically up to being 30, just doing that all the time, every single day. And to be honest, I've not really had a normal job all of my adult life. I think the last time I had a normal job was in 2004, where I was a music technology teacher for a bit. I mean, since then, it's all been either studio work or music or just something, and now it's podcasting.
How old was you when you got the opportunity to work in the studio? Because I believe, like I say, you've just been hanging around.
That's it. I was hanging around, and it must have been 17, 18. I just started assisting down there. The guys down at the studio was so impressed with how interested I was.
How old were they, looking back?
I mean, they were only maybe 7 or 8 years older than me, but at the time they seemed like old men,
Yeah, just kids in the 20s and stuff like that.
But yeah, they seemed so old and so mature and so knew what they was doing. But they were so impressed that I was just there all the time showing up. And I'd rarely ask questions. I'd just sit at the back and just watch, but they could tell I was so interested. So one day, one of the guys called me up on a landline. Remember the landline phones? It was like, do you want to come down and just train? We'll train you up because I can see how interested you are. You're showing up all the time. That's the most important thing. Come down and we'll train you up. I'm like, yes, please. So from then on, I was just down there all the time assisting. At that stage, I wasn't being paid. I was just running errands and going to chip shop for them, getting them cups of tea, doing whatever just to make the bands in the studio happy. But at the same time, I was learning. And when the session was over, I'd get my hands on the gear and I'd remix all the sessions that had been in that day and just play around with whatever had been going on, like get behind the drum kit, record some of my own stuff. It was just a really fruitful time for learning.
Was this pre-Pro Tools or just kind of as the transition was happening?
No, it was pre-Pro Tools. This was on digital tape, so it wasn't analog tape, it was digital tape, but everything was recorded in a linear way. There was no putting things to the grid on computer and quantizing and no pitch correction or anything like that. There was none of that. It was just you start recording and you finish recording, and if you've not done it good, then you go back and start again and you erase what you did before and you go over it. No going back, no undos.
Yeah, you got to be rehearsed going in the studio back then.
Exactly, which most people are not. That's the very same thing now. I think back then, sometimes you used to go to studios and record stuff and it sounds terrible, and sometimes you go to other studios and it sounds good. I don't think it's as much in the equipment that you was recording on at the time that made the difference. It's just how prepared you were and how good you was as a band. There's bands that can go in and be set up in a few hours and just absolutely nail it, and there's no substitute to that kind of thing. And I think learning to do those sessions back then in that way has really benefited me today if I'm going to go into a recording studio, because I've gone through all the various changes in studio stuff where you've got this ability now to just change everything that you're recording in to be absolute perfection. And I've gone through that stage where I did that myself. I'd always be editing drums and really manipulating the performance as a producer, Mutt Lang style, really going in detail. But now I find that the music that's most rewarding for me to listen to is often where it's not done in that way, where it's not edited to perfection, where it's not cleaned up as much. There's some spark and some there's something really enjoyable about listening to something that's a little bit raw and edgy and not had that life eaten out of it, So because I've learned in those old days how to do that, it's been quite easy for me to transition back towards doing that and actually make records that are actually vibing much more so than current contemporary records whenever I get a chance to make a record.
Definitely, man. How long did it take for you to have the confidence to branch out on your own?
As you know, when you visited my old studio, I used to have my own place after this point that we've just been talking about. I think I was kind of pushed out a little bit.
This guy's getting too good. Get him out of here.
I don't think it was as much that. I left for a while from that studio to do the music teaching. Like I said before, I was a music teacher for a few years and training up, trying to be a teacher, and really realized that wasn't for me. I hated that. And at the same time, I felt really sick from doing something that I wasn't enjoying. My place was to be in that studio making the music and not teaching it. So after a while, I finished there and I went back to the studio that I was originally at, but on paid work. So all of a sudden, I'm earning a living doing what I want, and it's great. And I'm pulling in bands from not only in the area, but outside the area, and even as far as other countries. Like people were traveling suddenly to work with me, not for the studio.
Is that through your connections with touring and things like that?
Touring. And when you're in a touring band, you meet people every single day and you get into these conversations. It's like, oh yeah, I record music as well. Do you want to come in? It's like, yeah, cool. So they'd travel firstly from places like Leeds and Sheffield, and then it branched out to like Birmingham and a few other places. And yeah, so I just got really busy. And at the time, one of the people that worked in that studio, he was an alcoholic, and he'd come in the middle of the day, start drinking and leave in the early hours of the morning and just be a mess, basically. There was a few times when I'd be out in the area, maybe skateboarding or something like that, and at the night, and I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to pop in here and get a drink. So pop into the studio, and then, so the caretaker had seen me entering the building at night. I was only going in really just to get a drink. And later on, it turned out the alcoholic guy had left with the doors open, not alarmed, and he did that on several occasions. And because that caretaker would see me that one time going at night, I got the blame for it. And I was the new guy, so I had to take the fall, as opposed to this old guy that was 20 years older than me that was, an alcoholic mess. So I kind of got pushed out. I didn't get pushed out. I just had my keys taken off me at the time, and it was like absolutely gutting. I think I was like maybe 22, 23, something like that. So at that age, you're still almost like a child, aren't you? And it was one of the first real blows to me, like a real knockback.
Like reality blows, real life things.
Up until that point, I feel like I'd been in control of where my career was heading, and it felt like that was like the carpet was pulled out from underneath me. So I just did what I knew best. I went and found another property and did recording on such a small scale until I could build it up and build it back up again. I got a place in Barnsley, the one that you visited, and at first I was just recording with a few mics in an old living room. Then I eventually built that into a recording studio, and I was there for like 7 years, and I started doing really well, like getting record labels interested in me, and I had quite a lot of releases, about 100 releases, all on different labels, hardcore and punk bands and metal bands and some indie bands.
Which were some of the favourite projects during that time? Obviously, you recorded the JD and the FDC's album, and you also worked with Sorry and the Sinatras, who unfortunately we lost drummer Lenny Thomas a few years ago, and most recently the lovely Roger Siegel. Do you have fond memories of those sessions?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, up until the Sorry and the Sinatras session came in, the studio was pretty rough and ready. And then when I found out a band was willing to fly all the way from Philadelphia in the US to work with me, I was like, they can't turn up to this shithole, I've got to do something right. So basically in space of about 2 months, I built this really nice studio, and I was still wiring it together that day that they arrived. So that was like a pretty funny story that they probably tell, is like arriving and the studio's me popping up from behind the desk with a bunch of wires and being like, oh yeah, I've got to still cable all this up. Anyway, those guys were crazy because they were really professional touring band. They'd been in professional touring bands, like Scott was still in the Wild Arts at the time, and the other boys were just straight off the back of Trash Light Vision.
How was it to record? I would imagine recording Lenny and Roger, the bass and drums, would have been pretty awesome.
I mean, that record is warts and all. That is another one of those records where it is them in a band. I didn't really need to do anything there. That is what they sounded like at that moment in time. And I feel like that's that's why that album gets so much praise, and people that are into that kind of thing still know that record today, still play that record today. It is a very accurate representation of what went down. Those guys got in a room, I set them all up live. It's mostly live, but then overdubbed on top of it. But it's them in a room playing together, and it's an accurate portrayal of that, I feel. But yeah, the first day that they arrived, I'm still soldering and putting the studio together. Those guys went out and got pissed. They ended up in some crazy situations. I guess it doesn't really matter if I say it now because Roger's sadly passed, but those guys went out looking for cocaine and they ended up in this strippers party. They tried to get these drugs without paying for them, basically, and ended up coming back from the police station in the morning, like, I don't know, 8 a.m. or something like that. They'd been out all night, you know, in a brawl. And this is their first impression of Barnsley. And you're just like, great.
Welcome to the hometown. Let's record an album.
But I think it just added to the vibe. It added to the, you know, the intensity of that record.
And like I say, you had that studio for 7 years, but I believe the circumstances surrounding the owners of that property weren't ideal.
No. Like I said, I was in a pretty dire situation when I first got that place. I needed a place. It didn't matter what it was. I needed some space. And what had happened was my old housemate, who I ended up living with there for a while, he was in another band that I'd been recording. And I was catching a bus into the city centre. I bumped into him. It was on the same bus. And it was like, oh, cool, get chatting. He's like, oh, I'm just going to do a photo shoot with my band on top of the roof of this building. Come with me, come check us out. I was like, cool, yeah. So I had nothing to do. I went with him on this photo shoot on this roof. And I was like, oh, that building looks cool. That space looks awesome. That might make a great studio. And he's like, well, I'll ask about it for you if you want. And then literally within the next week, we was moving in. As simple as that. Like, he knew this owner. So he managed to get it for incredibly cheap rent, talking like we had 2 apartments and we lived in one apartment and we had the studio in the other apartment. And we paid about £200 a month or something like that for what's a huge space.
For 2 premises, effectively.
Yeah. The only catch was, this is not going to be above board. Nobody's going to know you're here. I'm not going to do anything for it. The place was an absolute shithole. Like, there was no doors on the back. There was windows smashed through. There was an homeless person had been living in there for a while. There's no water plumbed in, so he'd been using the toilet all completely full.
Home sweet home.
There's no carpets, no nothing. It was just a shell of a building that was a complete wreck. And he's like, I'm not doing anything. If you guys want it, you do what you want with it. It's fine, but just pay me that money every month. That's fine. But I'm not doing anything. And we had that as a deal, you know, we could do what we want and pay cheap rent. But the downside of that, because it wasn't above board, the people that actually owned the building, not the business. So my landlord was just the licensee of the building. So this guy being a really dodgy guy, him and a couple of his friends running other bars, they decided one year to get this Arctic lorry, fill it full of cleaning fluid and brew their own vodka in the back of this Arctic truck. And then they were selling that in the bars as vodka. Somebody died. So somebody died from drinking it and he got sent down for manslaughter.
Nuts, dude.
Yeah. So my landlord then skips bail and goes back to Turkey. And the people that own the brewery come into the bar and with the new licensee that they'd just sorted out. And they're just like, who are you?
Why is there a recording studio in my building?
We don't know nothing about this. And I'm just a bit like, well, I've been here 7 years, you know, and I've made a really nice job of it, you know, fitted all like electric and water and new kitchen, new living room. Then there's a recording studio that's providing a great service to the entire town, if not most of Yorkshire. And cut a long story short, he ended up booting us out.
What happened to the place? Do you know?
Well, firstly, he tried getting me out because his son was a musician, thinking that I would leave the studio all in place and he would be able to just take over the studio. That didn't happen. I ripped the entire thing out, which I'm not going to leave that for somebody else. There was so much work gone into it. So now it's a bar. They basically took the entire roof off what was my studio, and that's a rooftop bar now with another bar underneath it. So, yeah. How
did you visualize the immediate future from that? Because this is, again, it's a setback from a studio situation.
So this is like, maybe I'm 29, just about to turn 30. Yeah, I think I'm 30. And I've got this other huge setback, and I went into a really low state. I was so depressed. I was borderline suicidal. I was in a huge despair at the time. I couldn't quite figure out what to do next. I had a dream. I had a dream that I would get a church, convert that into an even bigger studio. At the time, I felt like I had outgrown that small space anyway, so it's cool. Let's just move on and do something even bigger now.
Yeah, there's something you planned. It's just happening sooner than...
Yeah, it's something I've dreamt about, but it's not something that I ever felt like I could actually manage to do that. So it just so happened that literally days before was the last day of being there, my mum called me saying, I've just found this church. Let's go have a look at it. I was like, cool, let's go look at it. But there's no way that I'm going to be able to afford to buy it. I've just been turfed out of my place. I've got no income coming in whatsoever. Yeah, we went to see it and it was perfect. A little bit further away in Lincolnshire, but it's fine. People were traveling to me at that point. And I couldn't get a mortgage being self-employed. It was so difficult. So my parents remortgaged their house to buy the church for me. And then I would be paying them back.
How did you feel about that? Was you comfortable?
It was very stressful for my parents. I would never do that again, to put my parents in such a stressful position, because the way that it ended up, I didn't realize how expensive something like this was going to be. I pretty much built my old studio on definitely less than £10,000 and figured that I could just do that kind of thing again. Just do it on the cheap. Don't spend any money on labor costs. Do it all myself and me and my dad, and we'll knuckle down and make it happen. So I spent all my time on the recording studio design forums, and I got really interested in architecture. So I did it properly. I learned how to 3D model. I learned how to design proper acoustic spaces with all the correct room modes and all the acoustic elements, make sure that it's all right. And everything that I'd want in a dream studio was pretty much to go into this design. And I spent 3 years designing the studio and learning architecture to do it right. And I got my plans passed through planning permission, and I got all the, the proper drawings. I had them all made up, and we set about building it. But instead of it just being like timber and plasterboard and just simple, cheap materials at the time, it was like, we're going to have to do this out of concrete blocks and steel reinforced ceilings. And by the time it got to putting the concrete in, we literally couldn't afford to do it. We ran out of money, we ran out of budget. There were some problems with the roof that we had to get fixed, and it drained our entire budget. I think we ended up about £50,000 down from what his original budget was because of the roof was in such a bad state. The money just disappeared and we just were left unable to complete it. So because that was putting such stress on my parents, them still having to work to pay that kind of thing off, I didn't feel right about it. Bear in mind, these 3 years, I'm still in this mental headspace of being at my absolute lowest. So at the time, I think it was just the right choice to sell it on. And some old lady that bought it that wanted to make a retirement house for her and her sister. And we ended up getting nearly the same money that we'd shelled out for it. We sold it for more money than what we paid for it. But then there's all these costs that had occurred over that time. So we didn't really lose too much other than that 3 years of time. But in the same sense, I feel like I've learned so much because, like I said, I studied architecture in that time. I know exactly now how to build a perfect studio. Since then, I've designed studios for other people as well. There's another feather in my hat, designing other people's studios. I've gained all that knowledge and experience through doing that kind of thing, where at some point when I do that again now myself, I'll be able to do it instantly. I know exactly what's right to do.
So how was your journey back? You've been taking all these knocks. It wasn't putting you in a good headspace. Was this when podcasts came on your radar, which technically sounds crazy in a way?
I don't think it's so crazy. I liken it to be like this, right? When I was working in music and I was playing drums in a band, touring, being in my own band, going to band practices, going touring, but then also coming back and working for other people in the studio. And that was my everyday. It seemed for me like I lost the love of music. Music became a job. It wasn't an enjoyable thing. So in my real low point of my life, I found podcasts. I was going to therapy and learning all about human behavior and trying to figure out what was going on in my head.
Was you able to speak to anybody about it prior to therapy or anything like that?
I've got some good friends that I did speak to about it, but it was definitely an internal decision. It was like, I need to fix this part of me. So as soon as I went to therapy, I was like, I'm going to apply all these same principles to learning human behavior. And that just took me to podcasts. It took me to listening to psychologists and people talking about social sciences and different things like that. And I got so into that stuff where I was just living, breathing, that kind of thing. So I was really enjoying podcasts. I wasn't enjoying music anymore because I was trying to do it as a living. So I just followed the enjoyment path, and I offered my services one time because at that time podcasting wasn't a big thing.
So that was fairly early days. What would that be?
2012. So at that time, having somebody doing audio engineering on a podcast, that wasn't a thing, like podcasts pretty much were a phone call, with maybe a mini disc attached to it somehow, it was really crude and terrible sounding, and eventually Skype was the thing and podcasts sounded terrible. But I was an audio engineer listening to this terrible quality, and I contacted one of my clients now, one of my good friends, Jordan Harbinger from the Jordan Harbinger Show. And I just said, look, I can clean your show up. I can make it sound better than it is. And I don't need to charge you for it. I'm willing to work for free just to give you back some of the value that I've been getting from listening to your show for the last year or so. I'm taking away so much value by getting over these mental health conditions. Let me work for free and I'll clean this audio. And I wasn't really thinking much about it. It was probably going to take me an hour a week or something like that to do. So it wasn't a big deal for me to offer it for free or whatever.
You casually mentioned your friend Jordan in that, but Jordan Harbinger, even back then, he was one of the biggest podcast hosts. I think he was getting around 40,000 downloads a month, but still at the top of the charts.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's all it took to be at the top of the podcast charts back then. It was early days for podcasting. I mean, if I'd have said, I'm going to charge you for doing this at that time, I probably wouldn't have got that position working for such a good podcast, but I don't think anybody else in the industry was doing that. So I kind of just got in there early doors with it. As the show grew, I got more and more responsibilities to, editing the show and co-producing the show. And it ended up being that, he had no other way around it. He had to pay me just for his own self-consciousness, So I started getting paid, and it grew from that to a point now where I'm working for sometimes up to 10 shows at a time. And it's become my proper business now, is podcast production.
What was Jordan's initial response to your first edits? Do you remember?
I feel like at the time when it wasn't just cleaning up the sound, but actually going in and editing, I feel like it was a huge relief for him to not have to do that kind of thing himself. And I think this is all part of growing proper business rather than just working for yourself or being self-employed, is delegating tasks that you really shouldn't be doing as a business owner. So I think it was just a nice progression to a point now where I've got people working for me because I'm trying to grow the business. It's part of a progression, I think, when you operate in a business rather than just working for yourself. It's something that you need to do if you ever expect to grow. And for him, it was a huge relief at the time to just say, you know what, I trust you. You've been working for me long enough. You know what I want. You're used to hearing what it is that I'm doing. I can trust you. You go do it.
Because I think you said you treat podcast episodes in the same way you would an artist's song or album. That's, for me, particularly inspiring. Many people say, well, if the content is great, then people will listen. But I'm guessing you see it as taking things to the next level. Yes, the conversation is great, but it can sound and overall just be so much better. Similar to, well, yeah, the demo's great, the song's great, but how do we make it awesome?
So there's much more to podcasting than just putting a microphone in somebody's face and letting them just talk and then putting that out as it is. I feel like the best podcasts that I know of are curated and edited before you even start recording, like there's preparation. There's maybe a week's preparation that's gone into this. There's a whole bunch of back-end stuff before you even start recording. And then once you have recorded, there's a whole bunch more that you can do from that point to further distill those conversations down into being something that's some kind of substantial piece of work. And when I say that about like comparing it to a band's album, I just feel like the albums that me and you have connected to most in our life, there's something substantial about them. There's something, again, that connects with you on an emotional level that ticks all the boxes. It could be, I feel like if I was a fresh listener coming to the Jordan Harbinger show, I'd want that same light bulb moment as what I had when I was in my lowest point of life. I want that tipping point, that same kind of connection as what I got back then. I want that for other people. And at this point, we're talking like millions and millions of people that listen to his show. A lot, 1 million downloads every month. I can't remember what the number is now, 14 million, something like that. I want that tipping point moment for whoever's listening that's coming to that show, needing whatever advice it is that we're putting out that week. So distilling the conversation down to its most important parts, getting rid of all the fluff, is exactly the same as what you do in making a record with music. So think of how many hours a band spends in the rehearsal room fine-tuning those moments before they ever get to the studio. And this is the editing part. You get to the studio often and you're playing an A and they are playing an A sharp, and you're just like, wait, I've always played that, you know? Those moments. You've had those moments, right, Lainey?
Still have them.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like the post-production element of the conversation is ironing out those parts. It's those parts that are not quite coherent with one another. The more that you can make that music flow, the more that you can make that conversation flow, the more it's going to connect. What we saw with Jordan Harbinger show is early doors, when it went from, like we said, 40,000 or something downloads per month to millions and millions per month. Over that time, it's just, I think it's been that refinement that's led it to that place.
People keep coming back because they know it's going to have that standard.
Exactly. Yeah. If you can have your listener go away with a connection to something, a feeling like they've learnt something, and if they can retain that information because they've not been distracted, that means that they're going to come back to the next episode. They're always going to want to come back to get that same light bulb moment, that same dopamine rush when they find out something else that they didn't know about, or they talk about something that the audience is really interested in. Maybe they're in that flow state that I've talked about before, that feeling like you're consumed by something and you hit upon a nerve and they're like, oh, I love it, you know?
Definitely, man, definitely. How have things changed since you initially got in touch with Jordan? Podcasting, it's now such a huge thing. So, like you say, you was one of the original people who saw an opportunity as a podcast engineer. Are there a lot out there now, or is it still quite a niche market? Do you feel competition?
I don't feel competition, but I know it is out there. So I know there's competition out there. I don't feel it. I feel like I'm in my own little bubble. I'm confident in what I do. I'm confident in what we as a company deliver. I'm sure there's always somebody out there wanting to take what I do. I hear it all the time. Sometimes we get complaints into some of the shows that we work on where people will be like, oh, this sounds crap, you know, like I should help you sort this out. And those are people that are only fishing for my job. And it's pretty obvious. You can read those emails and be like, yeah, they're just fishing for work. You go back and check it out and it's completely fine what it is that we've done. Or, you know, there's been an issue that specific episode, but it's not overall an issue when putting the show out. Those kind of complaints usually are people that are fishing for my work. And it's understandable. I mean, I pretty much did the same, you know, but back when there was no competition. I think how things have changed is, yeah, it's like one of the biggest broadcasting mediums now, isn't it? It's cool to be a part of it. I feel like in parallel to the podcast world, you've also got the YouTube world. And I feel like most people don't really know the difference. And I feel like there's a huge difference between those two platforms, and that the way that people digest that information. I feel like the way that you absorb that information is different. You're attached to a screen when you're on YouTube, and I feel like the length of time's quite important. It might not be important, but I feel like it's important because I know that I'm ready to switch videos, even the videos that I'm really interested in, within 10 minutes or so. You know, the concentration is different. Whereas with podcasts, you're out and about doing your shopping or commuting to work or going to the toilet, you know. So I feel like you can listen to things for longer on a podcast than you can watch stuff on video form.
Do you feel you're at a point now where you can see yourself pivoting again within the world of podcasting? Say you're delegating work now, you say, as a business owner and growing your business. Where do you see your role perhaps over the next few years?
I just want to move into more of the business owner type of position, stop working in the business and start having the business work for me. And that includes giving value back to other people by giving them jobs, like being an employer much more so, and being there for my employees. And I can do that much better by taking myself out of the actual working role and grow the business properly. As far as the podcast world goes, that's where I need to be heading much more. I have, in the same way as I did with the music when I was just doing it too much, I have fallen out of love with podcasts. I rarely ever listen to a podcast. And I know that sounds stupid with me being a podcast producer, but if you're doing it all day, every day, last thing you want to do is listen to a podcast.
You find yourself going back to music?
That's the thing. I absolutely love music now again, more than ever. So I would like to spend a bunch of my free time in the future going back to music and getting back with that, because that's what got me into all this in the first place is music. So I need to get back to that roots of what it is, why I got into all this stuff in the first place. Podcasting's been a great vehicle to allow me to do that, whereas I always struggled before with music as far as earning a living from music. Now I don't need to earn a living from music. I can just do the business and enjoy music, or why I originally got into it in the first place. It's almost like a childlike naivety going back to that, like, cool.
But how awesome is that? That's like a proper full circle.
Yeah, it really is.
I think one of the most positive things I could take from your journey, and something you've touched on previously, is that through all the good and the bad, and even in the worst times, something that could be seen as a failure, it's always been leading to something new and learning other things. Is that something you've realized recently, or has that always been a mindset?
I think it's been there ever since I got therapy. That was a big learning curve for me, is this idea that things are not always your own fault. It's just the way that things are, but it's how you deal with these things that's the most important thing. These troubling times are going to come, and it's all about how you deal with them. And I don't even feel like I've had failures anymore. I feel like they've just been learning experiences, chance for me to grow as a person. And I'm really only here today through my mistakes that have led me to where I am. And I'm happy that all those things in the past happened. Getting thrown out of that first studio, having to build my own, and then losing that place to get in an even bigger place, and then not being able to afford to finish my dream off, then spending so much time traveling the world and learning social psychology and human behavior in myself. And I'm prepared now to tackle anything that comes at me. I really feel like I could probably take on anything right now. Because of that, I've used it all as learning experience.
Awesome, mate. It's an amazing journey. I'm sure people will be able to take something from it. 100%, mate.
Oh, thank you so much. I feel really like I was tongue-tied at the beginning. I'm so sorry.
It's fine. It's all good, mate. It's all good. It'll sound great. No, I appreciate you chatting with me, mate, and keep on doing all the great stuff you're doing. I always look forward to your little YouTube videos when they come out, and I'm hoping there's going to be some more to come in the future. And I appreciate your support of this show as well, and all your kind words.
I think like what you've done here with this podcast, sorry if I'm adding more things to it, but you've done what most people don't do when they get into podcasting, and that's keep going. Your persistence of putting these out and just really having these great conversations with everyone that's touched your life in a way, I really see that it comes through, like how you've been so emotionally connected to each and every one of these people that you've interviewed, that these people that have made a difference in your life, and getting these conversations out there and being so persistent at it. Nobody else has really been so persistent with it. Most people quit doing the podcasting after like 13, 15 episodes. And what number are you on now?
I've just done 175.
Wow. That's it. If you want to be a podcaster, that's what you got to do. Beat Laney's score of 175.
I'm clawing towards that 200 mark. I'm on my knees, clawing.
Honestly, man, I'm not joking. It's remarkable to get to that stage.
I appreciate it, mate. No, it's like you say, though, you got to enjoy it. It's a lot of hard work. It's more work than I envisioned going in. People say, oh, you do 2 a week. I'm like, well, yeah. One of my favourite podcasts is Mark Maron, biggest one in the world. He does 2 a week, so I'm doing 2 a week.
Exactly. Well done, dude. I'm so proud of you.
Cheers, mate. Well, thank you ever so much for spending some time with us, mate. You enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully I'll get to see you in person. Hopefully it's not 10 years. Why don't you come over to see the JD and the FDC's 10th anniversary gig?
What's the date again?
It is, when is it? 2nd of July.
That sounds doable. Cool, man. I hope to see you there.
thanks so much to Jason Sanderson for chatting with me on the Straight to Video podcast, and also for putting so much great information out there to everyone who is forging their way through the podcast world and making it so much easier. As mentioned earlier, if you're a podcaster yourself, check out what Jason and his company do over at podcasttech.com or on his excellent Podcast Tech YouTube channel. If you enjoyed today's talk, then this, along with over 170 more episodes, can be found wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can find them all conveniently located at stvpod.com, along with some straight-to-video music, videos, and merchandise. And if you're a regular listener who would like to support the show a little bit more, then please consider checking out the Patreon page, where for as little as £2.50 a month, you can be happy to know you're really making this show grow and keeping it up and running. In return, you get early heads up on guests, a private Facebook group, a bonus movie podcast, and access to some exclusive merch you will not find anywhere else. All the info is over at patreon.com/STVpod. That is all for today's show. I really appreciate you all listening in, and please check back every Tuesday and Friday for a new episode. But until we chat again, take care and speak soon.